Lewis Hamilton just sent an earthquake through Red Bull's fancy little empire, dropping a bombshell that's got their engineers sweating bullets. This year, he'll be driving the absolute best car he's ever had. And let's be real, when a 7-time world champion says that, you better sit up and listen. Stick around until the end because Hamilton's latest comments are so shocking they might just give Christian Horner a mild existential crisis. Oh, and subscribe only if you want to see Hamilton grab that 8th title, cement his legacy, and make sure the GOAT debate ends with his name carved in stone. Now, let's talk about the absolute madness that Hamilton just walked into. After 2 decades in Formula One, racking up 7 championships, breaking records like they were made of cheap plastic, and generally rewriting the history books, he's making the kind of move that nobody saw coming. This isn't just a fresh start. This isn't just a new chapter. This is the equivalent of a Hollywood plot twist that makes you rewind the movie because what the actual hell just happened? Jumping ship to Ferrari isn't about comfort. It's not about convenience. Hell, it's not even about money, though let's be real, the paycheck ain't bad. This is about legacy. It's about stepping into the unknown, about proving something. To himself, to the world, to those die-hard fans who never doubted him, and maybe even to those who did. From the second he set foot in Maranello, reality hit him like a damn freight train. This wasn't like strolling into Mercedes' pristine Brackley headquarters, and it sure as hell wasn't like those early days at McLaren's high-tech lair. No, this was different. This felt almost sacred. The air itself seemed to buzz with history, thick with the echoes of legends who had walked these same halls. Ferrari isn't just another F1 team. It's the team, the very heartbeat of the sport. It's a living, breathing beast that has inspired as much fear as it has reverence. And subscribe only if you want to see Hamilton shut down the haters and hoist that 8th championship trophy. Walking through the corridors of Gestion Sportiva, Ferrari's F1 nerve center, he could practically feel the ghosts of champions watching him. These weren't just hallways. They were shrines to icons. Schumacher, Lauda, Ascari. Names that aren't just spoken, but whispered with a kind of devotion usually reserved for gods. The walls were covered with snapshots of glory. Cars slicing through the rain, podiums drenched in champagne, victory celebrations that had become the stuff of legend. But there were also reminders of the heartbreaks, the brutal near-misses, the years of pain that had shaped Ferrari just as much as their triumphs. Because Ferrari, unlike some of the other teams, cough Red Bull cough, doesn't just win. They suffer. They struggle. And then they rise. Subscribe only if you're ready to see Hamilton make history once again. And then came the moment. The first time he laid eyes on the Ferrari that would carry him into the 2025 season, something stirred inside him. Curiosity, excitement, maybe even a little fear. He'd driven some of the most dominant machines F1 had ever seen, but this was something else. It wasn't just a car. It was a weapon. A sculpted, fire-breathing, aerodynamically obsessive piece of art that had been engineered with a kind of fanatical precision that bordered on insanity. Every inch of it screamed purpose. The sleek lines, the intricate bodywork, the way it just sat in the garage, like a damn predator waiting to pounce. The second he slid into the cockpit, he knew. This wasn't just another F1 car. This thing was alive. The weight of expectation pressed down on him harder than ever before, but he thrived on that kind of pressure. Everything was different. The buttons, the ergonomics, the way the dashboard fed him data in a whole new language. Small details, maybe, but in a sport where milliseconds separate glory from humiliation, small details are everything. And then, the moment of truth. The engine roared to life, and holy hell, it was a sound unlike anything he'd ever felt before. Not just heard, felt. Deep, guttural, almost primal. He'd raced against Ferrari engines for years, but now he was inside one. And it didn't feel like just another power unit. It felt like a statement, a war cry, a declaration of intent. Hamilton isn't here to play. He's here to dominate. And if you want to see him snatch that 8th title and silence every last critic, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. This wasn't just another race car. This wasn't just another season. This was a goddamn mission, a meticulously crafted machine built for one singular purpose: to drag Ferrari back to the promised land, to snap them out of a decade-long cycle of almosts, maybes, and holy shit, how did they screw that up again? Because let's be honest, Ferrari had spent the last 10 years in a frustrating purgatory. They weren't backmarkers, but they sure as hell weren't dominating, either. Every time it looked like they were about to rise from the ashes, they tripped over their own feet and face-planted into another disastrous strategy call, another pit stop blunder, another opportunity pissed away. And now, Hamilton had stepped into the middle of this beautiful, chaotic mess. He knew the stakes. He knew the risks. He also knew that, beneath all the hype and adrenaline, there was an unshakable truth. This was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. Ferrari wasn't like any other team he'd raced for. At Mercedes, he had been the center of the goddamn universe. The undisputed king. The driver around whom everything revolved. He had built something with them, a dynasty, a fortress of consistency and dominance. He had his people. Engineers who knew his every preference. Mechanics who could practically read his mind. Strategists who had steered him to 6 world titles with surgical precision. Ferrari. Oh, Ferrari didn't work like that. Ferrari didn't bend to a driver's will. Ferrari was its own beast, one governed by its own laws, its own deep-rooted traditions, its own highly political, borderline Machiavellian, blink-and-you-route way of doing things. Loyalty? Oh sure, the team demanded it. But did they offer it in return? That was a different question. History had proven that Ferrari was more than capable of chewing up and spitting out some of the most talented drivers to ever touch an F1 car. They tested their champions in ways that no other team did. And Hamilton, despite his legendary status, despite being one of the most decorated racers in the sport's history, was not going to be an exception. But his real challenge wasn't just the car. It wasn't the engineers. It wasn't even the relentless pressure from the tifosi, those die-hard Ferrari fans who expected nothing short of instant success and had absolutely zero patience for failure. No, his biggest obstacle? Charles Leclerc. Leclerc wasn't just another quick driver. He was Ferrari's chosen one. The golden boy. The prodigy they had nurtured, shaped, and built their future around long before Hamilton had even thought about signing a contract. He had been through it all. The heartbreak, the botched strategies, the gut-wrenching losses that should have been victories. He had bled for this team, suffered through their mistakes, and now? Now he was being asked to share his kingdom with a 7-time world champion. Yeah, that was not going to be an easy coexistence. Power struggles were inevitable. There was no sugarcoating it. Ferrari had never been good at handling 2 alpha drivers in the same garage. History had made that abundantly clear. Prost and Mansell? A disaster. Schumacher and Barrichello? More dictatorship than partnership. Alonso and Massa? A ticking time bomb. Vettel and Leclerc? A slow-motion car crash. These weren't teammates. These were rivalries disguised as professional relationships. And now, here we were again. Would Ferrari throw their full weight behind Hamilton, handing him the resources and the influence he needed to mold the team into his vision, like Mercedes had? Or would they hedge their bets, keeping Leclerc as their long-term investment while giving Hamilton just enough support to make it look like a fair fight? That lingering uncertainty hung over him like a goddamn storm cloud. And then, there was the car itself. Could Ferrari even build a championship-winning machine? Because let's be real, none of this mattered if they were still going to pull the same bullshit that had haunted them for years. No matter how fast Hamilton was, no matter how perfect his performances, it wouldn't mean jack shit if Ferrari kept tripping over their own shoelaces. Would they finally find consistency? Would they stop making strategy calls that looked like they had been cooked up by a drunken turn? Would they deliver a car that was not just fast, but reliable? Something that could actually go the distance without an engine failure, a gearbox issue, or a pit stop meltdown? Or would this season go down as another wasted opportunity? Another chapter in Ferrari's endless saga of frustration and missed chances? And if that happened, what then? What if this whole gamble went down in flames? Because let's be real, Hamilton wasn't some bright-eyed rookie with time to spare. He wasn't the young kid who could bounce back from a failed experiment and try again a few years later. By the time he lined up on the grid in a Ferrari for the first time, he'd be 40 years old. If this didn't work, there was no easy way out. No safety net. No cozy return to Mercedes. No second chance to right the wrongs. This wasn't just about winning another title. This was about legacy. This was about stamping his name into a history far bigger than himself. Because conquering Ferrari? That's not just winning. It's ascending to another level. It's stepping into the realm of legends, of icons whose stories are told for generations. It's about etching his name onto a legacy that started long before he was born and will continue long after he's gone. This was the defining moment of his career. And now, as the countdown to 2025 began, the entire world was watching. Would he rise to the challenge? Would he defy the odds, tame the chaos, and carve out his place among the immortal legends of Ferrari? Or would he become yet another name on the long, painful list of drivers who had tried and failed to tame the beast that is Maranello? One way or another, there was no turning back now. And from the very first lap, Lewis Hamilton knew this was unlike anything he had ever faced before. This wasn't just another high-performance race car. No, calling the Ferrari just a car would be like calling a thunderstorm just a bit of rain. This thing had a soul, a raw, unpredictable, almost rebellious spirit that seemed to hum beneath the sleek red bodywork. The second Hamilton rolled out of the pit lane and stomped on the accelerator, he knew this wasn't like anything he had ever driven before. The way it reacted to the slightest flick of his wrists, the way it glided through corners at breakneck speed with a level of grace that bordered on sorcery, the way it transmitted every microscopic detail of the asphalt beneath him straight into his fingertips. It was intoxicating. This wasn't Mercedes, where every car had been engineered to be a surgical weapon, a machine so ruthlessly precise, so immaculately balanced, that driving it sometimes felt like operating an advanced piece of alien technology designed to obliterate the competition with robotic efficiency. No, Ferrari was different. This machine had bite. It had a temper. It had mood swings. It wasn't something you just drove. It was something you tamed. It demanded a level of connection that was almost spiritual. Every turn of the wheel, every dab of the throttle, every squeeze of the brake pedal mattered in a way that was both electrifying and downright exhausting. Speed wasn't the only goal here. The real challenge was learning its quirks, understanding its moods, figuring out where it shined and where it tried to kill you, and then, finally, bending it to your will. But as exhilarating as those first laps were, Hamilton knew damn well that this was only the beginning of the battle. Driving the car? That was one thing. Owning it, making it his, extracting every last molecule of performance from it and molding it into an extension of himself? That was something completely different. And the bigger challenge? It wasn't just the car. It was the entire world he had just stepped into. For the first time in over a decade, Hamilton wasn't the center of the universe. At Mercedes, the whole operation had been built around him. Everything had been tailored to his strengths, adapted to his feedback, fine-tuned to his exact preferences. He had spent years developing an intimate understanding of the people around him, forming relationships that allowed him to extract the absolute best from the engineers, the strategists, the mechanics. That team had run like a goddamn Swiss watch, a machine so well-oiled, so in sync, that very few teams in the paddock could even dream of matching it. But Ferrari was a different beast entirely. This wasn't a place where he could just stroll in and call the shots. This was an institution, an empire that had spent decades crafting its own way of doing things. A team steeped in history, in tradition, in a level of passion so intense it sometimes teetered on the edge of chaos. Decisions weren't always made based on pure logic, cold calculations, and spreadsheets full of probability data. No, at Ferrari, emotion played a role. Instinct played a role. Sometimes, even politics played a role. And Hamilton wasn't above any of that. If he wanted to win here, he needed to adapt. He needed to earn trust instead of assuming it was a given. He needed to navigate the unspoken alliances, the hidden hierarchies, the complex relationships that dictated how this team operated. Winning in a Ferrari wasn't just about being fast, it was about playing the long game. It required patience, diplomacy, and the ability to read the room like a goddamn fortune teller. And then, of course, there was Charles Leclerc, the golden boy of Ferrari, the heir apparent, the driver who had been handpicked to lead this team into a new era. Hamilton wasn't just joining a new team, he was stepping into Leclerc's kingdom. This wasn't some random rookie trying to prove himself. Leclerc had bled for Ferrari. He had suffered through every misstep, every strategy blunder, every gut-wrenching defeat that should have been a victory. He wasn't just fast. He was blisteringly, terrifyingly fast. On a single lap, the kid was lethal. He could extract every last drop of performance from a car in qualifying, dancing on the very edge of grip in ways that made even seasoned veterans shake their heads in disbelief. But more importantly, he knew the car. He knew the team. He knew the systems, the setup philosophy, the the way the car needed to be driven to get the absolute most out of it. And that was an advantage Hamilton didn't have. This wasn't just another teammate to beat. This was a deeply embedded part of Ferrari's DNA. A driver who had spent years forging relationships with the very people Hamilton now had to rely on. This wasn't like his past rivalries. This wasn't Alonso at McLaren. This wasn't Rosberg in those bitter Mercedes wars. This wasn't even George Russell, who had come in hungry, talented, but still trying to find his place. No. This was Hamilton stepping into someone else's domain and having to prove, day in, day out, that he could not only match Ferrari's chosen one, but beat him. And Ferrari had never been good at handling two alpha drivers in the same garage. The history books were littered with civil wars. Prost versus Mansell. Schumacher versus Barrichello. Okay, not really a rivalry, but still awkward. Alonso versus Massa. Vettel versus Leclerc. Every single time Ferrari had two titans sharing a garage, shit hit the fan sooner rather than later. So the question wasn't just whether Hamilton could outperform Leclerc. It was whether Ferrari would actually let him. Would they fully back him, give him the resources, the strategic edge, the ability to shape the team around himself as he had done at Mercedes? Or would they play the long game with Leclerc, hedging their bets, giving Hamilton just enough to stay competitive but never fully giving him the keys to the kingdom? That uncertainty loomed over everything. And then, there was the car itself. Because none of this political maneuvering, none of this internal power struggle, none of these mind games mattered if the car wasn't fast enough to fight for the title. Could Ferrari finally build a machine capable of winning a championship? Or was Hamilton about to spend the final years of his legendary career trapped in the same cycle of false hope and broken dreams that had plagued this team for a decade? Because let's be real, Hamilton wasn't 25 anymore. If this gamble failed, there were no do-overs, no easy exit, no cozy return to Mercedes, no second chances. He would be 40 years old when he lined up on the grid in Ferrari red for the first time. This wasn't just about chasing another title. This was about legacy. Because conquering Ferrari? That was a holy grail achievement. And now, the world was watching. Would Hamilton tame the beast? Would he defy the odds and carve his name into Ferrari's hallowed history? Or would he become yet another name in the long, painful list of champions who had tried and failed to master the chaos of Maranello? One way or another, there was no turning back now. And from the very first lap, Lewis Hamilton knew this was something he had never experienced before. This wasn't just about speed. It wasn't just about talent. It wasn't even about adding another damn trophy to the already overstuffed cabinet of Lewis Hamilton. This was about winning people over, convincing an entire army of engineers, mechanics, and strategists, many of whom had spent years working with someone else, that he was the guy. That he was the man who could drag Ferrari back to the top, kicking and screaming if necessary. That he could be the one to lead them back to the promised land. And then there was something else. Something he couldn't afford to ignore. The car itself. Ferrari's machines had always carried a very particular DNA. A certain attitude. A specific way of behaving that was nothing like what he'd grown accustomed to in his decade-plus at Mercedes. This team had a long-ass history of producing cars that demanded an aggressive, no-holds-barred, all-or-nothing driving style. Ferrari didn't build cars to be polite. They weren't interested in easy-to-drive, well-balanced, predictable machines. These cars wanted to be thrown into corners at speeds that made lesser drivers question their life choices. They needed a driver brave enough to rotate the rear end mid-corner, to trust the front grip when common sense screamed otherwise, to walk the tightrope between genius and insanity on every single lap. Hamilton. He had spent years piloting precision-crafted, ultra-stable machines. Cars that prioritized consistency, refinement, and efficiency. So now, the million-dollar question was, could he make the transition? Could he unlearn over a decade of habits? Could he reprogram his instincts to extract the absolute maximum from a machine that played by an entirely different set of rules? Because make no mistake, this would decide his fate at Ferrari. This would determine whether he would go down as a legend in red or just another name on the ever-growing list of champions who came to Maranello with high hopes and left with a suitcase full of regrets. And then, because this wasn't hard enough already, there was the pressure. And holy shit, was there pressure. The unrelenting scrutiny of the Italian media, the unrealistic expectations of the tifosi, the never-ending comparisons to Schumacher, Lauda, and every Ferrari legend before him. At Mercedes, Success had been measured in cold, clinical efficiency, dominance that was almost mathematical in its execution. At Ferrari, winning wasn't enough. It had to be dramatic. It had to be spectacular. It had to be the kind of performance that would be remembered for generations. It wasn't just about results. It was about legacy. Hamilton knew that this wasn't going to be some smooth, easy ride. There would be battles. There would be disappointments. There would be moments where the sheer weight of the challenge seemed absolutely fucking impossible. But that's why he was here. He hadn't joined Ferrari for a comfortable final chapter. He hadn't signed up just to pad his resume. He had come here to prove something, not just to the world, not just to Ferrari, but to himself. This was the final test. The ultimate challenge. Because winning with Ferrari? That wasn't just another title. That was immortality. That was elevating himself into a realm that went beyond even the 7 world championships, beyond the shattered records, beyond anything he had done before. This was about doing what only the greatest had ever done. And so, as he completed those first laps, as he felt the car underneath him, as he began the painstaking process of understanding and mastering this beast, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready. Ready for the fight. Ready for the war. Ready to do whatever the hell it took to succeed. Because this, more than anything else, was what he had been looking for. Chance to make history. Again. And there was something almost mythic about this moment. Something that felt like fate had been pulling him toward this all along. A collision of destinies. The intersection of the greatest driver of his generation and the most legendary team in F1 history. From the very start, racing had been more than just competition for Hamilton. It had been a calling. As a kid, he had idolized Ayrton Senna. He had watched in awe as the Brazilian master danced with his McLaren, pushing the limits of man and machine as one. But the dream had never just been about becoming another Senna. There had always been another vision, lurking in the back of his mind. A vision of himself draped in Ferrari red, commanding the Cavallino Rampante, just like so many icons before him. Because Ferrari wasn't just another team. Ferrari was racing itself. The soul of Formula One. The institution where legends were forged and history was written in tire smoke and champagne spray. And now, finally, after rewriting the record books with Mercedes, after achieving more than anyone had thought possible, Lewis Hamilton had arrived in Maranello, stepping into a lineage of greatness that carried the weight of 7 decades of triumphs, heartbreaks, and unrelenting ambition. This wasn't just about winning races. This was about proving that he could succeed in an environment completely unlike anything he had ever known. This was about sitting in the same seat as Michael Schumacher, Niki Lauda, Juan Manuel Fangio, Alberto Ascari, and Gilles Villeneuve, each one an untouchable icon in their own right, each one eternally woven into the fabric of Ferrari's legend. But with that glory came a burden unlike anything else in motorsport. Because Ferrari was different. It operated under a level of scrutiny that no other team could comprehend. The expectations were suffocating. The pressure was relentless. For the Tifosi, the fan base that was more religion than fandom, Ferrari wasn't just a racing team. It was a way of life. Victories weren't just celebrated, they were exalted. Defeats weren't just setbacks, they were national fucking tragedies. In Italy, Ferrari was sacred. And now, Lewis Hamilton was part of that. There was no turning back. This was either going to be his greatest triumph, the crowning jewel in a career already dripping with greatness, or it was going to be the ultimate heartbreak. One way or another, history was about to be written. And Hamilton, he was damn well ready to grab the pen. Ferrari wasn't just a racing team. It was woven into the goddamn fabric of motorsport itself. A living, breathing legend that carried the weight of generations. And those who donned the famous red suit? They weren't just drivers. They were warriors, entrusted with the impossible task of bringing the Scuderia back to its former glory. Hamilton was no stranger to pressure. He had spent his entire career under the blinding spotlight of expectation. He had faced adversity both on and off the track. He had been scrutinized, criticized, doubted, and dragged through controversies, only to emerge victorious time and time again. But even he knew, this was different. At Mercedes, he had been given order. A structured, methodical environment where everything operated with precision and control. Decisions were made through calculated deliberation, mountains of data, and long-term strategic planning. Ferrari Ferrari thrived on chaos. This was a team powered by pure emotion, passion, and a relentless hunger for victory that often teetered on the edge of desperation. Internal politics had chewed up and spit out even the greatest of champions. Power struggles had shaped seasons just as much as car performance. And the ghosts of past failures? Oh, they were still lurking. Fernando Alonso had come agonizingly close, dragging Ferrari to the brink of a title, only to be undone by strategic miscalculations and internal turmoil. Sebastian Vettel had inherited the same dream, only to watch it crumble under the weight of expectation and a relentless string of errors. Would Hamilton suffer the same fate? Would he become just another name in Ferrari's tragic cycle of hope and heartbreak? Or would he be the one to finally break the curse, to return Ferrari to the dominance it once wielded under Schumacher's iron-fisted reign? The moment he sat in the car for the first time, he felt the weight of history settle onto his shoulders. The cockpit was both familiar and alien. The layout of the controls, the placement of the buttons, the subtle nuances of the seating position, everything felt slightly off compared to what he had spent years perfecting at Mercedes. But the biggest difference? That came when he fired up the engine. A deep, guttural snarl echoed through the garage. This wasn't the smooth, polished hum of the Mercedes power unit, the one he had grown so accustomed to over the years. No, this was raw. This was unfiltered, untamed, straight-up feral. This was Ferrari. And then came the first lap. It was like a punch to the face. The car didn't just respond, it reacted, like it had a damn mind of its own. It was aggressive, unpredictable. It had an edge to it, a stubbornness, like it was challenging him to prove he was worthy of taming it. Mercedes had designed masterpieces of efficiency, machines that seamlessly connected driver and technology, allowing for nearly perfect execution. Ferrari built wild animals. This car wasn't going to hold his hand. It wasn't going to make life easy. He had to fight it. He had to wrestle with it. He had to convince it to obey. It wasn't enough to drive it. He had to tame the beast. The way it attacked corners, the way it unleashed its power, the way it responded to braking, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had expected a challenge. What he hadn't expected was how goddamn exhilarating it would be. For the first time in years, he felt like he was rediscovering racing. That raw thrill of uncertainty, the rush of learning from scratch, the pure adrenaline of adaptation. It was a feeling he hadn't had since his very first F1 test, when he was a young driver on the edge of greatness, discovering just how far he could push himself. But excitement alone wouldn't be enough. The road ahead was treacherous. Because it wasn't just about taming the car. There was Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's golden child. The chosen one. The driver they had spent years grooming to lead them into a new era. Outwardly, their relationship was friendly. But let's be real. There was no room for two kings at Ferrari. History had proven it time and time again. Ferrari was notorious for picking a single driver to lead the charge. And once they did, the other guy was on his own. So the real question was, could Hamilton impose himself as the clear number one? Or would Leclerc's deeply ingrained roots within the team make him an insurmountable force? Because this battle wasn't just about speed. It was about politics. It was about alliances. It was about who held the keys to the kingdom. And it wasn't just the car or the competition that made this experience so radically different. It was the entire goddamn universe surrounding it. Ferrari wasn't just a team. It was a religion. A sacred institution, deeply woven into the very core of motorsport history. Walking into Maranello wasn't like joining another F1 squad. It was like stepping into a temple, a place where legends had been forged and dreams had been shattered. Here, victories weren't just celebrated, they were immortalized. Defeats weren't just disappointments, they were catastrophes. For Ferrari fans, the Tifosi, this wasn't just a sport. It was life itself. In Italy, Ferrari wasn't just a racing team. It was the beating heart of the nation. And now, Hamilton was part of it. Would he thrive under this unmatched pressure? Would he break the curse and return Ferrari to its rightful throne? Or would he become just another chapter in the long, painful history of champions who tried and failed to tame Maranello? One thing was certain. He had walked into something far bigger than himself. And whether he conquered it or it broke him, one way or another, history was about to be made. Every single breath in Maranello carried the weight of history. It wasn't just air, It was thick with the whispers of past triumphs and soul-crushing failures. The ghosts of champions lingered in these halls, their footsteps forever etched into the same paths Hamilton now walked. There was a tangible gravity to this place. From the factory walls to the museum filled with relics of victories long past, everything about Ferrari screamed that it was more than just a team, more than just a brand, more than just a legendary manufacturer. Ferrari was a force of nature, a dynasty that had not only defined entire eras of racing but had rewritten the damn rulebook along the way. For Lewis Hamilton, this wasn't just another career move. This was stepping into a completely different philosophy, a dramatic shift from the calculated, almost sterile precision of Mercedes. At Brackley, everything had been designed for maximum efficiency, an empire of robotic perfection, where data ruled all, where engineering brilliance was the foundation of dominance. Ferrari was chaos and passion wrapped in a prancing horse emblem. It wasn't just a racing operation, it was an identity. A living, breathing organism that functioned as much on emotion and instinct as it did on science and strategy. It was a family, an ideology, a belief system that had been forged over decades and passed down through generations. At this point, Ferrari had transcended motorsport. It wasn't just a team, it was a religion. And the Ferrari factory? It wasn't just a place where cars were built. It was a cathedral. Hamilton had spent years in Brackley, where every decision was made based on calculations, simulations, and data models so detailed they could predict the goddamn weather. Success at Mercedes wasn't just expected, it was manufactured. A byproduct of relentless innovation, a well-oiled machine that eliminated uncertainty wherever possible. Ferrari was a completely different wavelength of madness. The people here didn't just work for the team. They lived for it. Every single engineer, mechanic, and strategist carried a responsibility that went far beyond their job titles. They weren't just employees. They were the gatekeepers of a legacy, the torchbearers of an empire that demanded not just effort, but devotion. Wearing the Scuderia Ferrari badge wasn't just about representing a team. It was about becoming part of something immortal. And as Hamilton walked through Maranello, he felt it in his bones. History was everywhere. It was etched into the walls, painted in the air, embedded in the very ground he stepped on. The black and white photos of Enzo Ferrari loomed over him like a silent godfather, watching, judging, reminding every person in these halls that this was his empire. That every single soul who passed through these corridors had a duty to uphold his vision. The championship trophies? They stood like sacred relics, shimmering testaments to the giants who had come before. Ferrari didn't just celebrate victories. They immortalized them. And defeats? Those weren't just setbacks. They were scars, reminders of the brutal, unforgiving nature of this place. Hamilton had spent a year picturing this moment, imagining what it would feel like to finally climb into a Ferrari cockpit, to pull on that legendary red race suit, to walk through these hallowed halls with the weight of decades of racing history pressing down on his shoulders. Leaving Mercedes had been the most emotionally draining decision of his career. He had walked away from a sanctuary, from the people who had built an empire with him, from the engineers who had crafted his success with the precision of a goddamn Swiss watch. It hadn't been easy. There had been doubts. Sleepless nights spent wondering if he was about to torch everything he had built. Was he leaving behind a dynasty that he had spent more than a decade constructing? Was he gambling his entire legacy? Would Ferrari actually give him the tools to succeed? Or had he just walked into a political minefield, a team just as famous for its internal battles as it was for its racing brilliance? The media had been relentless. The questions had been non-stop. Every single press conference, every interview, every casual conversation circled back to the same skepticism. Why leave Mercedes? Why now? Why Ferrari? Was this just a desperate attempt to chase one final title? Had years of dominance at Mercedes dulled his hunger, making him susceptible to the romanticism of Ferrari rather than the reality of its chaos? For months, those questions had haunted him. But now, sitting in a Ferrari cockpit, with the raw, snarling beast of an engine rumbling beneath him, vibrating through his chest like a goddamn battle cry, all of that doubt evaporated. This wasn't just another new chapter. This was destiny unfolding. But with destiny came an unimaginable burden. Because Ferrari didn't just compete in Formula One. Ferrari was Formula One. It was the soul of the sport. The team that had been at the center of every era, that had watched legends rise and fall, that had outlasted time itself. And yet, for all its greatness, for all its unmatched mystique, Ferrari had been starving for glory for over a decade. That drought hung over Maranello like a goddamn curse, a suffocating pressure that crushed every driver who dared to try and bring Ferrari back to its throne. That was the challenge Hamilton had willingly signed up for. Succeeding here wasn't just about winning races. It was about resurrecting an empire. It was about carving his name into history, proving that he could conquer the one arena that had eluded him for so long. Because at Ferrari, good wasn't good enough. Winning was only the beginning. This wasn't just about adding another title. This was about immortality. But the road ahead? It was a goddamn battlefield. Ferrari wasn't just another team. It was a political maze, a power struggle wrapped in racing glory, a place where loyalties shifted like the wind. Favoritism wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was deeply embedded in Ferrari's DNA. Hamilton knew this wasn't just about speed. This was about navigating the madness, about earning his place in an empire that had crushed champions before him. The battle had just begun, and whether Ferrari would make him or break him, history was about to be written. Charles Leclerc wasn't just another teammate. He was Ferrari's golden child, the one they had nurtured from the start, the man they had handcrafted for success, the driver in whom they had invested their entire future. And no matter what the press releases said, no matter how many times Ferrari swore up and down about equal treatment, and both drivers having the same opportunities, Hamilton wasn't stupid. He knew damn well that real equality in Formula One was about as real as a unicorn riding a skateboard. Power. You fought for it. Respect. You demanded it. Dominance. You imposed it. If he didn't establish himself as the undisputed leader of this team from day one, he'd be setting himself up for failure. He'd end up on the wrong side of history, watching Leclerc get the priority treatment while he was left fighting for scraps. Every move he made would be scrutinized. Every word that left his mouth would be dissected, twisted, and turned into headlines by the Italian media machine, a beast known for being as merciless as it was relentless. These weren't journalists. These were assassins with pens. They had the power to make or break a driver overnight, to turn a hero into a villain before breakfast. At Mercedes, he had been protected. The team had been his fortress, shielding him from external bullshit, carefully managing narratives, ensuring that the pressure never consumed him. Here, there was no such sanctuary. The Tifosi were passionate, but they were also unforgiving. Ferrari drivers were either worshipped as gods or cast aside as failures. There was no middle ground. The pressure wasn't just intense, it was suffocating. The expectations weren't just high, they were fucking astronomical. But as he sat in that cockpit, his fingers gripping the controls, he felt something crystal clear settle into his mind. This was exactly where he was meant to be. This was the fight he had been looking for. This was the battle that would define his legacy. And make no mistake, this wasn't just a tough road ahead. This was a gauntlet. A brutal, relentless, no-holds-barred test that would push Hamilton past every limit he had ever known. The championship fight wasn't going to be a sprint. It was going to be a fucking war. A war of attrition, where endurance, adaptability, and mental toughness would matter just as much as raw speed. This challenge, it was unlike anything he had ever faced. Because this wasn't just about learning a new car. This wasn't just about adjusting to a new team. This wasn't just about getting comfortable in a new environment. This was about reinventing himself, at an age where most drivers were either retired or just hanging on for a paycheck. This was about proving, once again, that he could defy time, that he could resist the natural decline that came with age, that he could take on a system that had historically rejected outsiders. And standing in his way? Charles fucking Leclerc. This wasn't just another teammate rivalry. This was a collision course. Because unlike his past teammate battles, Alonso, Rosberg, Russell, Leclerc wasn't just a competitor. He was the embodiment of Ferrari's long-term vision. The chosen one. The anointed heir to the Scuderia throne. The driver Ferrari had molded in their image, protected through the rough seasons, and back through every high and low. Leclerc wasn't just fast. He was ingrained into the very core of Ferrari's operations. He had spent years building bonds with engineers. He had solidified relationships with mechanics. He had earned the loyalty of the team's upper management. In many ways, he was the beating heart of Ferrari. But now, Now, the ground beneath him had shifted. Hamilton's arrival was a seismic shift, a clear signal that Ferrari was willing to deviate from their original master plan in search of something bigger. And for Leclerc, this was both an opportunity and a fucking nightmare. Because now, he didn't just have to prove himself on track. He had to fight for his place within the team. He had to make damn sure he didn't get overshadowed by the arrival of a 7-time world champion with a resume that made even legends look small. For Hamilton, the challenge was just as overwhelming. For almost a decade, he had been in a team where he was undeniably the centerpiece. Every decision had been made with him in mind. Every strategy call, every technical development, every tiny adjustment, all designed to maximize his strengths. Now, he was stepping into the unknown. Into a team that wasn't built around him. Into a dynamic where loyalty had already been spoken for. Into a battle that was just beginning. And the question wasn't just who was faster. It was who would take control. Because in Ferrari, there was only room for one king. And Hamilton, he wasn't here to be anyone's second option. Now, Hamilton wasn't stepping into a familiar, well-oiled machine where he was the undisputed king. He was entering enemy territory. Here, he wasn't the established figurehead, the automatic priority, the man the whole operation revolved around. He was the new guy. The disruptor. The wild card that Ferrari hadn't quite figured out how to handle yet. And whether he liked it or not, team politics were inevitable. Because every championship-winning team functions under an unspoken hierarchy, a structure that dictates who gets the priority when it really fucking matters. At Mercedes, that had been his spot. No question. No debate. At Ferrari, that power balance hadn't been rewritten yet. Would they fully back him, giving him the resources, strategy, and influence needed to shape the team around his strengths? Or would they try to walk the tightrope, keeping both drivers in check, refusing to choose a side until it was too damn late? Would there be internal fights over preferential treatment? Over car development? Over who gets the better pit strategy on race day? Would the engineers, strategists, and decision-makers rally behind Hamilton? Or would old loyalties, the deep-rooted ties they had forged with Leclerc over years of working together, prove too damn strong to break? And beyond the internal war, there was the battle happening outside. A relentless war against Red Bull and Max Verstappen, the reigning champions who had turned Formula One into their personal playground. Red Bull hadn't just built the fastest car over the past few years. They had perfected an entire system. An unstoppable machine that ran with surgical precision. And Verstappen, he wasn't just a fast driver. He was a fucking force of nature. A relentless, merciless competitor with a driving style as aggressive as a rabid dog, a mental toughness borderline psychopathic, and a hunger for victory that made Prime Schumacher look casual. Red Bull wasn't just a good team. They were a fortress, built entirely around Verstappen's dominance. Every single aspect of their operation, from the car's design philosophy to their pit wall decisions, was engineered to maximize his success. And for Hamilton, this was a completely different war. At Mercedes, he had battled Ferrari. He had gone wheel to wheel with Red Bull. He had fought against rivals who weren't backed by a system functioning at its absolute peak. But now, he was stepping directly into the lion's den, going head-to-head with a Red Bull juggernaut that had reached peak efficiency. Every race would be a chess match at 200 miles per hour. Every qualifying session, a fight for survival. Every pit stop, a potential turning point in the championship battle. Because in a season where the smallest details could decide the final outcome, Hamilton knew one thing for sure. If Ferrari wasn't perfect, they were fucked. If they made the same strategic errors that had haunted them in recent years. If their reliability issues reared their ugly head at the worst possible moments. If their decision-making under pressure remained as shaky as it had been in the past. Then Hamilton's mission to bring Ferrari back to glory would turn into a goddamn nightmare. And Red Bull wasn't the only problem. Because lurking in the shadows was Mercedes, the very empire Hamilton had walked away from. They might have struggled in recent seasons, but let's not get it twisted, they still knew how to win. Their dynasty hadn't been erased overnight. They still had one of the sharpest technical teams in the paddock. They still had deep knowledge of car dynamics and an insane ability to evolve under pressure. And now they had something to prove. Hamilton had left, and they sure as hell weren't going to let the world believe that he was the only reason they dominated for a decade. They were going to come back swinging. Then there was McLaren, the wild card, the team that had silently but steadily been transforming into a real contender. Lando Norris had become one of the most naturally talented drivers on the grid, a blazing fast racer who had proven he could go toe-to-toe with the best. And McLaren, they had been cooking in the background, refining their car concept, sharpening their strategy and execution, positioning themselves as the next big player in the title fight. They weren't an afterthought anymore. They were a real fucking threat. A team capable of snatching crucial points, throwing a wrench into the championship battle at the most unexpected moments, and adding even more chaos to an already explosive title race. Every single race weekend would be a high-stakes brawl. The conditions, tire degradation, track evolution, every microscopic factor could swing the balance of power. The margin for error? Non-existent. A botched pit stop could mean the difference between victory and humiliation. A poorly timed strategy call could wreck an entire race. A single mechanical failure could torpedo the championship campaign before it even began. And then, hovering over it all, there was Ferrari itself, the invisible, omnipresent force that had broken so many before him. Driving for Ferrari wasn't like driving for any other team. At Mercedes, the pressure had been massive, but it had been managed, controlled, handled with methodical calmness. Here, this was a different kind of beast. Ferrari didn't just demand success. They demanded a fucking miracle. And if Hamilton couldn't deliver it, the same tifosi who cheered his arrival would be the first to turn against him. This wasn't just racing anymore. This was a battle on every front. And the war had just begun. Ferrari wasn't just another team. Ferrari was emotion, pure and unfiltered. It was passion, so intense it bordered on obsession. It was expectation, on a scale so massive that no other team in motorsport could even come close. Every race, every move, every damn decision would be put under a microscope, dissected by the ruthless Italian press, analyzed by self-proclaimed experts, and amplified to absurd proportions by the millions of tifosi whose devotion to the Scuderia bordered on religious fanaticism. When Ferrari won, the celebrations were like nothing else on earth. Parades in the streets, flags waving, voices screaming, a nation collectively losing its mind in ecstasy. But when Ferrari lost, holy fucking hell, the backlash was merciless. The criticism wasn't just harsh, it was scorched earth. Drivers weren't just questioned, they were publicly crucified. Team bosses weren't just criticized, they were torn apart like prey in a lion's den. And engineers, if the car failed, they might as well have gone into witness protection. This was Ferrari. And for Hamilton, this was an entirely new kind of pressure. A pressure that wouldn't just test his driving skills, but also his mental strength, his patience, and his ability to navigate an environment where the highs were euphoric, but the lows could crush a man's soul. There was no running from the cold, hard reality of what he had signed up for. This wasn't a team in the middle of an era of dominance, where success was expected and winning felt routine. This was a team desperate to reclaim its former glory, a team starving to be back at the top, a team that had been wandering in the desert for 17 long, painful years without a driver's championship. That was the last time a Ferrari driver had been crowned world champion. And every damn year since had been a reminder of their failure, a scar on their legacy, a constant, gnawing agony that they had failed to reclaim the throne they once considered their birthright. And now, at 40 years old, Hamilton had walked straight into this storm, willingly putting himself at the center of one of the most high-pressure, emotionally charged projects in the history of Formula One. No safety net, no guarantees, no way to back out. The task ahead? Fucking monumental. The road to victory? Littered with obstacles, booby-trapped with chaos, and guarded by some of the most cutthroat competitors the sport had ever seen. The battle? More brutal than anything he had ever faced. But as he gripped the steering wheel, feeling the raw, untamed power of the Ferrari coursing through his hands, sensing the history, the legacy, the impossible challenge in front of him, he knew exactly why he was here. This wasn't just another season. This wasn't just another challenge. This was the moment that would define the final act of his career. Because let's be real, he hadn't come to Ferrari to fade into the background. He hadn't come to be a supporting character in someone else's fairy tale. He hadn't walked into the lion's den just to be another footnote in Ferrari's long, tragic history of almosts. No, he had come here to fight. To prove, beyond any doubt, that even after smashing every record, after winning 7 world titles, after rewriting the history books over and over again, he could still rewrite them one more time. The path ahead, merciless. The enemies, powerful as hell. The obstacles, unrelenting. But that's exactly why he had chosen this road. Because, at the end of the day, legends aren't built on easy victories. They're forged in fire. And this, without a shadow of a doubt, would be the biggest test of his legacy.